Well, hello, everybody, and welcome again to another episode of the Risk Matrix. You're in the Matrix, baby, with James Junkin.
Roll Tide, football's here. I know that's for another podcast, but I can't tell you. Sometimes I lay in bed at night during the off season and wonder if football misses me as much as I miss it.
Yeah, I'm sure it does, James. I'm sure it does. And I'm his co-host, Dr. Martin. And today we have a guest, Mr. Glenn Young, and he's going to talk about his book and some process safety management PHA stuff. A lot of us think we do know this. And I say we probably don't know as much as we think we know. And Glenn is going to enlighten us about the field and how to do PHAs and the questions to ask, etc. But before we get to that, James is going to tell us about our sponsor for this
Man,
episode.
I am super excited. We just got fired up at the ASSP conference in Denver, where I was there with 6,500 of our best friends, met Mr. Young there. He was signing books. His book we'll talk about today, which is Applied Process Hazard Analysis. And look, I have just recovered from ASSP's conference, but we might as well get ready because we're headed down to Orlando with the Veriforce team for the National Safety Congress and Expo be held down there September 13th to the 19th. We want you to come by the Veriforce booth, talk to the good people at Veriforce, learn how we can reduce risk in your supply chain, and I will be moderating what should be a very lively and highly debated session, panel discussion on bridging perspectives and serious injury classification in high-risk industries. In other words, what does S mean to you? So if you're down in Orlando, hit us up, look for us inside the expo, look for me on LinkedIn. We'd love to have you, love to talk about what's going on in your organizations and how we can help.
Awesome. James, do you want to introduce Mr. Young for us and bring
Absolutely.
him in?
Absolutely. Now, those that know me know I have an extreme passion about process safety. And I think process safety, whether it's a formal PSM facility that's covered under the OSHA standard or not, like some of the offshore facilities where I have my roots, is differently managed than personal safety. And a lot of OSHA regulations are written to protect the individual. But when we fail in process safety, we fail in a manner that cause great destruction to life, the environment, company assets, the surrounding communities, and it's usually spectacular in nature and usually all over the news. That's where I got my start in safety, Mr. Young, was in the BP oil spill in that process safety disaster. But I happened to be walking through ASSP on the way to get me a hot dog, and who do I see but Mr. Glenn Young signing books of his book, Applied Process Hazard Analysis. And I thought, man, look at that, the operational questions. And that really is a tool that has not been discussed in academia or in practice. So welcome, Mr. Young, to our podcast. We'd love to hear your perspectives on your book and about you. So we were talking before the session. How did you get into safety?
Well, I began operations in about 1976 at a chemical company, and I was the guy out there at 2 a.m. turning valves. And after we started the plant up, and after 15 years of working in it, I'd seen everything that could happen, and I was bored to tears. And so I was about to leave the company and go somewhere else, and my company said to me, "Wait a minute, rather than lose you, we have an opening in the safety department. Would you like to try that?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And so I got through industrial hygiene and process safety and a wide variety of other things there. And I was tickled by the concept of process safety simply because I had been an operator. I'd seen all the things that could happen. And so one of the things that I like to tell my PHA teams when we start a study is if James falls out of the pipe rack and gets killed, it's a tragedy for James, his family, the company, and the community. But it's not on the same scale as if we turned loose a tank of methyl ethyl death and we killed half the people in New Orleans. It's a whole different thing. So big ticket items are process safety items. And I think process safety got its beginnings in Bhopal, India, which those of us who were old enough remember. But it can be catastrophic if things go wrong and you've got a lot of high hazardous chemicals or toxic chemicals in your process.
You know, it really was amazing to me. I did a little white paper on process safety here recently, and I was going back and looking at the origins of process safety. And, you know, OSHA moves slow, regulations move slow, but it's kind of astonishing that it took all the way to 1992 and that incident in Bhopal, India, and the Phillips 66 incident out in California to really get the government into the mindset of regulation of places that have highly hazardous chemicals. So
Congress wanted to get that done in a big hurry, and they knew that at that time, none of the people in regulatory agencies had the expertise to do a standard in a big hurry. So they went out to industry and they said, we want your most experienced people, and we'd like to hire them to help write this standard. And they did a really good job of it in a really short time, and it came to be in a big hurry. I think the quality of the job that was done by the original founders of PSM is shown in the fact that in all the years since it came out, we haven't had any revisions. Now, we should, in the near future, get some revisions pertaining to reactive chemicals, which was one of the things that was left out of the original standard. But by and large, it's proven its worth again and again.
Well, you know, I find that particularly astonishing that there have been no changes to it, and to really, as an example, the veracity of the PSM standard. When everything happened with the Deepwater Horizon, and they wanted to shift away from API RP 75 to something more formal. There's not a dime's bit of difference. I don't know how familiar you are with SIMS 1 and 2, but there's not a dime's bit of difference between PSM and the SIMS regulations for the offshore oil and gas.
So James, I'm going to stop you there because our listeners are using a lot of acronyms. So can you go back and kind of run through for our listeners the acronyms, because I know a lot of people listening probably aren't PSM experts.
I have a phrase that applies to that, Jim. It's clairvoyance costs extra.
Clairvoyance cost extra. I like that. I like that. I always said this: it's easier to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict than it is to get safety professionals to agree on common acronyms.
That's true.
So API, American Petroleum Institute, recommended practice number 75. And before the Deepwater Horizon incident, there were a lot of recommended practices, and some forward-thinking. Pretty much the major oil companies adopted all the recommended practices of API RP 75, which was a safety management system guideline, right? Then some of the mid-sized ones got some of the elements that they liked, and then some of the smaller operators said, you know, we're not doing this at all because it was a recommended practice. People were shocked to learn in the aftermath of the BP oil spill that OSHA's authority pretty much stops at the beach.
That's true.
Okay. When you're out there, you're dealing with the U.S. Coast Guard and the EPA, and there really wasn't a lot of regulatory authority other than this API RP 75. There were some under different agencies that we're not going to get into and explain. But after the BP oil spill, stood down the offshore industry for a year, and they said, we need to get a safety and environmental management system in place. SIMS, that's the acronym, SEMS, right? And when you look at SIMS and you look at PSM, there's hardly any daylight between the two. And I think that's a testament coming out of that to the folks that wrote the PSM standard.
I'd have to agree. And just so if we have anybody listening that doesn't know what PSM is, it is part of the Code of Federal Regulations, 1910, which is General Industry, .119. And the specific title of that regulation is the Process Safety Management of Highly Hazardous Chemicals. And that's where the acronym PSM comes from.
And, you know, one of the things to further explain, and I like you mentioned this in your introduction to your book, when I think of PSM, and I think most safety professionals think of PSM, they think of refineries, very large chemical processing plants, but PSM can apply to even to industries that you've never thought of if the chemical you're handling is under the authority of the tables that are in PSM, the PSM standard you mentioned, and exceed the threshold quantity. I just had this big conversation not 30 minutes ago about a large warehousing company. If I called their name, you would know them, right? Everybody knows them. That uses hydrogen in some instances to fuel their powered industrial trucks. Well, because of the quantities, they may be under the PSM standard for that particular facility. So
I'll give you a couple of other interesting applicability issues with PSM. You can be temporarily covered by PSM. We have a show that comes through my city once a year near Christmas, and they create an ice rink in one of our local halls, and they freeze a sheet of ice over the entire floor, and it's done with an ammonia refrigeration system. And they've got enough ammonia in their cooling system that they are covered by PSM for the length of time that they're set up there locally, which I thought was interesting. But, you get all sorts of different things. I had a pipeline company that said, well, we don't at any given time have enough, process on our site to be covered by PSM. And I said, well, you may not have enough in your compressors, but if you have a rupture there, the other compressors in your system are going to keep pumping, and you're going to release far more than what you have on site. And if you calculate the potential release, then you're covered by PSM.
So PSM being a safety management system, whether your industry is right below the threshold values that trigger all these requirements or not, we've all seen what happens when we fail to identify process safety hazards. And the incidents are infamous in some cases. Large fires, large explosions, large releases, community sheltering in place, a lot of TV cameras, a lot of news, a lot of people impacted. And in your opinion, is the basis of the prevention of those incidents really found in this book about how to apply process hazard analysis? Is that the foundation of a functioning safety management system?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The PSM standard has 17 elements. That book is specific to one of the 17. And I had a curious conversation with a woman who had come by at the ASSP conference and bought my book. And she says, this is the best book I've seen on this topic. Why don't you write books on the remaining elements of the PSM standard? And I said, well, that would be 3 feet thick. And she says, no. She says, don't do it as a single book. Issue it as a series of volumes. She says, I can't imagine any engineering library that wouldn't want to have that set. And I said, well, thank you kindly. That's something that really be worth considering.
So much for retirement, Glenn.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so much for retirement, but that's okay. I can write those books off the top of my head pretty easily.
So thinking of process hazard analysis, most of the safety professionals that are listening to us in our podcast here are familiar with job hazard analysis or job safety analysis or job risk analysis or, pre-task.
Whatever they want to call it.
Whatever they want to call it, same thing. Steps to do the job, the hazards associated within the controls. How does a process hazard analysis differ from these task-oriented, field-oriented hazard analysis that we described?
Most of your field analyses are looking at human factors. They're going to review the steps of the job and make sure that nobody can get hurt doing those steps. Process hazard analysis is more focused on the equipment of the process and the steps through the process. For example, if we have a batch process, we get hit by lightning, process is shut down, but what's going to happen when power is restored? Is it going to resume from the beginning of the steps? Or is it going to begin where it left off? Or is it going to do nothing? Those are important questions. And PHA is intended to get into those and make sure that we do have procedures, training, and the equipment in place to handle such a thing if it were to happen. Or I should say, when it happens.
Right. Right.
So I haven't seen your book, Glenn. Shamefully, I will admit that James brought it back from the conference, and I haven't had a chance to chat him up about it yet. But let's talk a little bit about. I mean, what's step one? Like, is it who you bring to the table? Who do you bring to the table for this, and why?
You need a experienced engineer. They don't absolutely have to be familiar with the process, but it helps if they are. You need some experienced operators. I can't take the new guy. It's just been hired last week. He won't be able to answer the questions I'm going to ask. And curiously enough, the facilitator doesn't necessarily have to be familiar with the process. It's not your job to analyze the process. It's your job to coach the team to analyze the process. And you want to ask questions that aren't normally asked. And I've always have at least somebody on the PHA team that says, when I bring up a topic, they say, well, that's never going to happen. It's impossible. And I pull out my little book,
Famous last
look through it. I said,
words,
okay,
Glenn.
here are 2 examples of where it happened exactly the way I'm describing, you know. So we need to at least consider the possibility that this could happen.
Okay,
Bless their
so
heart, bless their
you
hearts,
assemble this
engineers are
team,
the worst.
right? Exactly. So you assemble this team, right? And we're looking at you said your book really kind of focuses more on the equipment side of things and what the questions are to ask. Is there a formula for that? I mean, how does the
No, it can be
facilitator
done a
proceed?
variety of ways. That's one of the things that makes process hazards analysis so flexible. You can use a what if method where you go through the process and say, okay, what if this happens? What if that happens? You can use a method called HAZOP, which I prefer for equipment. It basically has a list of things that can go wrong and said, how could this issue arise in this process? And let your team brainstorm. It's basically a qualitative, not a quantitative process.
And I've been through some of these. I used to work for a hazardous waste remediation company, and they dealt with a lot of the process safety issues just because of what they were dealing with, what they were extracting, the chemicals they were using for the extraction, etc. And so they did design reviews,
Yes,
30, 60, 90 design reviews as we went into it that basically followed a HAZOP process,
methodology,
right?
sure.
And then as we operated, we had HAZOPs periodically in order to keep us on track. Is that kind of the feng shui of how that
I used
works?
to
Or
recommend to my clients that they do a HAZOP in the design phase of a process. You're going to catch a lot of things there, and the operators who are familiar with process will say, some engineer got really creative here, but that's not going to work in the field, and here's why. But then once the process is up and running, within the first year, there's going to be a huge number of changes to it. Operators are famous for midnight engineering. We like to go out there and say, this isn't working so well. What can we do to improve it? And so after the first year is a good time to have another HAZOP and sit down and say, what have we changed in the process? And have we inadvertently overcome some of the safety features that were originally designed into it?
or
And
have we
we'll
created
find
new
out.
ones?
And we'll find out as we go through that we come up with a lot of recommendations that go to management. Now, that's another thing. You cannot tell management what to do. You need to identify the problem and say, consider ways to fix this, because there may be plenty of ways to go about fixing it, some more expensive than others, some, more easy to implement than others. And some are actually going to take ordering a new pressure vessel from somewhere, and it's going to take a year or two to get. So you never know what you're going to find, which is one of the things that I found kept me from being bored ever.
I understand. Well, certainly in your book, you talk about modes of failure.
I do.
Some common modes of failure that you routinely see being repeated across process safety facilities.
I've seen so many. It's almost hard to say anything that's repetitive because there are so many different things that can happen. Um, Maintenance is a big flashpoint when it comes to what can go wrong. Because a lot of times when the maintenance is done on a turnaround, management is saying, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, let's get it running again because we're losing money while this process is down, which is true. And so if maintenance gets too much pressure on them, they tend to let things slide. We had a turnaround one time and we had buttoned up a quench column and started the process. And we were having a huge differential pressure across that column, which should have had next to none. So we finally shut back down and opened up the column to have a look inside. And the maintenance people had left an entire set of scaffolding inside that vessel. And surprise, surprise, somebody dropped the ball or else pencil whipped the checklist when they put that one back together.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Leaving an entire set of scaffolding inside of a process vessel. That was
Two other things that maintenance are famous for is removing the reaction bracing on relief valves and rupture discs because they don't understand the purpose of it. And another thing that maintenance tends to do a lot is not replace fireproofing inside of vessel skirts or on structural steel or whatever, because to them it's just an impediment to getting what they have to take it off and then work on whatever they're working on and then put it back on. And a lot of times, particularly if it's degraded and difficult to work with, the putting it back on part just gets overlooked. And I've seen a lot of fires or jet fires and failures that were caused by maintenance not replacing the fireproofing as they should have.
You just gave us an insight into machine guarding too. I think that's what happens with machine guarding a lot
It
as
does.
well, is it's in the way. They got to get to it. It's quicker to leave it off than to put it back on. And I don't
Indeed.
want to go down that wormhole, but that's what I thought when you said that is that's exactly the same kind of thing. Is if it's in the way, it's got to go because stuff's got to get done in the middle of the night.
You're going to like my book.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
probably will.
So let me ask you a question. This has been my perception. You tell me if this is the reality. That typically problems, emergency type situations occur when we're shutting down or we're starting back up a process. The plane
Yeah,
doesn't
absolutely.
fall out of the sky.
That's correct. Yeah,
So
those are shutdowns, I'd say about a third and almost two-thirds for startups.
and usually that startup's coming out of a maintenance activity.
That's correct.
So I know management of your contractors is a key element of the process safety management standard, that you're responsible for these contractor employees, et cetera. What are we getting right in managing these contractors, and what do we need to improve on to prevent these process safety disasters and coming out of these turnarounds?
I could write a book on that alone. Um,
I'd read it.
Contractors, by and large, are very, very skillful and they got a lot of experience and they are very eager to do the right thing. However, they're often burdened by the fact that the quote unquote maintenance procedure for a piece of equipment was what was printed by the manufacturer 20 years ago. And it was written by engineers for engineers, and bless their hearts, the maintenance people just don't understand it.
Bless their
We
hearts.
had a lot of specialized equipment in the plant where I worked. We had wet acid processes. So we had carbon block exchangers, glass lined vessels, et cetera, all of which require really specialized maintenance procedures. And we had to not only tell the maintenance people what we wanted, but go out and watch them work so that if they were doing something they shouldn't have, no, 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 you can't use a hammer on that vessel. It's got the glass lining inside. And if you beat on it within a month, it's going to be leaking. So you have to coach the maintenance people on what you want them to do. And provided you do that, they'll be happy to comply. When I was fresh out of college and just become an operator, I wrote a work order one time that said, remove the peripherals from sea storage tank. And about 30 minutes later, the befuddled maintenance guy comes in and he says, "We looked all over that tank, but we just can't find anything that looks like a peripheral. Can you tell us, come show us what them peripherals are?" And I said, "Well, what I mean is to remove the blind flanges and the instruments." He said, "Well, why didn't you say that?"
Amen. Amen, brother. Right? That was a good lesson learned, wasn't it?
It was. And you have to work with the people you've got and not think of them as stupid, because they're not. You can learn a great deal from your maintenance people, but they need your cooperation in order to do their jobs well.
I just did an assessment. It wasn't a PSM facility, but it did have an anhydrous ammonia line that was coming through this facility. And as we looked into the contractor's training of their workers, 2 minutes, 56 seconds on lockout tagout in the online class. Yeah, go ahead.
Training is another big issue for maintenance people. They come from the union hall, and you have to presume that they're competent at what they're going to do, but that's not always the case. We had a situation in the plant one time where we were getting various and sundry shutdowns, which had no connecting cause. He said, "We just lost this distillation column. We just lost that pump. What's going on?" And finally, I looked up in the pipe rack, and there was a poor maintenance guy up there with a drill who was drilling holes into the pneumatic tubing bundle. And he was cutting random tubings at the time, and every time he cut a tubing, something else would go down. So, that was another situation where the maintenance people, bless their hearts, didn't understand quite what it was that they were trying to do. And that was a training issue. Had we told them in advance, training, the pneumatic tubing bundle is what runs the entire plant. And if you start messing with the tubings, things aren't going to go well. Now, anymore, a lot of plants use electronic controls, which is, I guess, better. But back in the old days, everything was pneumatic.
A lot of people call this different: great retirement, great resignation, the change of generations. This
Yes.
sounds a lot like a lot of these plants operate off of some nuance, some experience. Experience typically is mentored and passed down to other people. This gap that was exacerbated by COVID, are we in a riskier time now in process safety because a lot of that knowledge has left the industry?
Absolutely. I coach my clients to don't let your people retire, put them on a retainer. And that way, when you've got a problem you've never seen before, you call up that guy that was there 20 years ago and say, "Did you ever see this?" And you're very likely to get an answer. I learned the value of institutional knowledge shortly after I got into my safety department. We had an old guy there, old Phil, and we got a call one day that there's water coming up out of the ground over by the acetylene plant. And we went and looked, and sure enough, we had a fountain coming up. And I said, "I guess the water main is busted. Let's dig it up." And Phil said, "No, no, no, wait a minute." He says, "Before you do that, about 5 years ago," he said, "we put a patch on the water main about 100 yards in that direction over there. Why don't we go ahead and look there first?" And lo and behold, that's exactly where the leak was.
That's awesome. I love stories like that. I do. But I fear that we're drifting into some process safety red lines, if you will, because the lack of knowledge, lack of experience, not going back and bringing in your experienced workers as consultants and helping problem solve. But here's my question. This has been historically, I'm sure Dr. Trevor Kletz down at Texas A&M. Love his books. His book, What Went Wrong, is in my library, and every now and again I break it out. But he'd like to say this: organizations don't have memory. People have memory. And when people leave the plant, the memory of what happened and why we do things the way we do leaves with them. Has that been your experience as well?
It has very much. I have hopes that in the future we might be able to use artificial intelligence, particularly in process control. And if we get all the people there that have operated the control board for 20 years and say, okay, let's go through this and talk about all the things that happened, and we can set up an algorithm in our control system that will say, are you sure you want to do this? You know, the last time somebody did this, here's what happened. Do we want to do it again, or do we want to try this, which is what, you know, the control system recommends? And I
So
think,
Glenn, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, all right, listen.
I was just going to say today I got the Harvard Business Review. I read the Harvard Business Review for fun. I'm kind of
Sure.
weird like that. And on the cover, it said gapping or something to the effect of gapping to generation AI. And that's exactly what you're talking about there is feeding into the algorithm these things that we're going to lose.
Exactly.
And I think, and this is just my opinion, is unless you have a good organizational culture and you've got good coaches that really care about teaching somebody and somebody who really wants to learn, that institutional knowledge does not get, or the personal knowledge does not get transferred and held, right? I like to say back when I was doing project management in the environmental industry, um, there were a lot of times that I would let somebody fail in order to teach them how to not fail the next time.
Certainly.
And some people were really good at picking up those nuances. Some people really wanted to know and they really wanted to learn. And I really wanted to teach. And that was a match made in heaven. But that has to be the perfect storm, right?
It
If
does.
somebody doesn't want to learn or somebody doesn't want to teach, then where does it go?
Yeah, you can't live with lazy people, and bless their hearts, they mean well, but you can't
Bless their
live
hearts.
with stupid people either. They need to go
Yeah.
into politics, not into process operations. But one day, our we were training a young man on the board, and the plant manager walked by, and he says, "Mark, we just had a power failure, and every alarm on the board is lit. What do you do?" And Mark says, "Ah," he says, "I step back and go, ah."
At least he
Which
was
was an
honest.
honest answer, you know.
Yeah.
But he
I
was
call
learning.
Glenn and then I evacuate. That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, one of the things I've been interested in for many years, of course, is the historic, infamous, if you want to call it, CSB investigation down at Texas City in 2005.
Yes.
And all the changes that came out of that. Are we better now than we were then in process safety?
Yes, we are. The good news is that process safety is improving over time because companies are learning from each other's mistakes. But it's not a fixed slope to that improvement line. I would say chemical companies are doing pretty good at process safety. Refineries are maybe 10 years behind the chemical industry. Pipelines are 20 years behind the chemical industry. But they're working on it, and they're all making improvement. And where it will go, I'm not sure, but I can tell you back in 1976, when I first started working in chemical production, things were horrible. I didn't realize how bad they were until I'd been through enough stuff to become experienced. But you could not do some of the things today that we did back then. We just didn't know any better.
Exactly right.
Agreed.
Well, tell us a little bit about your book and how people can get your book.
Well, it's currently available through the American Society of Safety Professionals, but all of my other books they've gone ahead and put on Amazon, and I expect they will with this one as well. So before long, it's going to have a much broader uh, audience to look at it. And compared to the other books that I've seen on process hazard analysis, I think mine goes into better depth on quite a few things, but particularly onto the facilitators' issues of what questions should I be asking when I'm looking at specific equipment. Um, you have a variety of coach ideas in the book about who should be on your team. I once had a gentleman who had started up the plant and could walk out in the field and put his hand on anything with his eyes closed, but he could not read piping and instrument diagrams. And so I had to thank him kindly for his willingness to be on the PHA team, but I needed somebody else that could read the diagrams. Um, so you never know who you're going to get on the PHA team. If management has assigned you somebody that's not suitable, you have to go to management and explain here's the problem with this guy. You know, Jerry's a great operator. He's obviously very knowledgeable, but he can't do this, you know, and I need somebody that can think out of the box. They once gave me a little engineer that was fresh out of college, and I was at a refinery where I was working, and he could not conceive of some of the things that were eminently credible. They had a loading dock out on the Mississippi River. And I said, well, what's going to happen if a barge or ship comes floating down the river and hits your dock? You know, that's never going to happen. He says, we've been in operation for 34 years and it's never happened yet. So it's never gonna, you know.
Well, it's going to happen.
What's going to happen if a ship loses power and hits a bridge?
Exactly. It's a very obvious hazard. I was doing another facilitation up in Midwest, and they had a underground storage facility with like 100 and something underground caverns full of liquefied flammable gases. And when I first went there, I said, you know, you ought to consider putting auto close valves on the top of those caverns so that you don't have a catastrophe if somebody knocks the piping off of them. And I came back 5 years later to do another one, and they were quite proud of themselves. Look, we got valves on top of all of the caverns. I said, that's great. Where's your master shut-off valve that closes them all? He says, why would we need that? And I said, you're in tornado country. You just had a tornado pass through and threw an 18-wheeler out in the middle of your tank farm. A number of those are sheared, and now we've got liquefied flammable gas coming out there in a fire tornado. Show of hands, who's going to stay here and close the other 100 valves? And nobody raised their hand.
Wild Will will come do it, but if you have to ask them how much it's going to cost, you called the wrong folks.
That's exactly right. And another place I'd gone, I said, do you have an emergency shutdown switch? He says, oh, yes, sir. I said, that's cool. Where is it? He says, it's in that closet behind all those boxes. I said, how did it get there? He said, we were going to remodel the control room, but we never finished it. And so the emergency shutdown switch is in the closet where you can't get to it. But I find good things.
Perfect.
Yeah. I was doing one, we came across a certain situation, and I said, that's a really important alarm. Is it different than all the others? And or by, you know, lighting or sound or something? And the operator was quite proud. He said, oh, yeah. He says, that's a Lilu alarm. I said, what? He says, you know, it goes Lilu, Lilu, Lilu.
Well, thank you, Mr. Young, for coming. It's been a pleasure. I could listen to you for hours. You're a wealth of knowledge. I have a passion for process safety. Again, Glenn Young, certified safety professional with over 50 years of experience working with chemicals and chemical plants and over 30 years in safety.
Certified safety professional, retired.
Retired. I hear you.
Retired. Yeah. You better put that retired in there. They're going to cut the BCSP police are going to come after you. So
I spoke with him at the conference. I said, look, what I do. When I started this book, I was a CSP, but since then I've retired and I'm now a CSP retired. And he says, no problem. He says, just change it the next time when you do the reprint.
Yeah. Until you get the letter from him. But
right.
Well, anyway, thank you. This is the book, Applied Process Hazard Analysis. Even if you don't work inside of chemical plants or under a PSM facility, the axiom hazards are best controlled in the planning and design of the work, works in any safety management system, any task level. Good questions in this book for your what if analysis in order to put the right controls in place to protect workers, to protect the environment, and to protect the assets. So thank you, Mr. Glenn, for coming. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
If people want to reach out to you, do you have a LinkedIn?
I do not, but I've got an email address, should be in the book.
Okay. Let's see.
So while James is looking for your email address, just going to tell people that if you like what we do here on the Risk Matrix, you can go to the YouTube channel for Veriforce, and they post this every Tuesday. We're also on Spotify, coming out on Spotify. And if you like us, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and follow us for great content like today with Mr. Young. We'll help you stay safe, stay smart, think about things you haven't thought about maybe in a long time or ever. So join us here on the Risk Matrix. And James, I think you got that email address.
Not yet. What's
No,
your
don't
Oh,
worry about it. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll set up a LinkedIn account, and anybody that wants to contact me will be able to find me there.
Okay.
and we'll post it in our
Great.
comment sections for this
Thank you.
episode.
If you have something emergent, just message me on LinkedIn. Everyone knows how to get in touch with James. Message me. I'll get it to Mr. Glenn. We'll get you in contact with each other. But regardless, thank you for what you do in bringing workers home safe from high hazard jobs, Mr. Glenn. And y'all go get this book. Go get this book.
If you don't learn something you didn't know, I'll give you your money back.
There
There
you
you
go.
go. There you go.
All right.
Roll Tide.
Till next time, y'all keep bringing those workers home safe.
Indeed.